For 30 years, I've lived in a remote town called Broome, Western Australia. This is one of the most remote towns in the world. If you draw a circle around it for 600 kilometres, you'll only capture 20 to 30,000 people. So there's nothing more remote on the planet. During my time as a builder up there, I've built multiple things from shopping centres to tourism resorts to housing and so forth. And every time you actually go out and do it, there forms another problem to actually how do you actually build in these remote areas. So you always had to find a simpler and smarter way to do it, because quite often we'd actually have to build the workers' accommodation so then we can actually build the tourist resort or the housing. With my own project, this was quite interesting because we actually learned a lot from how do you actually do it differently. So we built a project called Eco Beach. And during that process, after 4 years, it got hit by a Category 5 cyclone, the strongest cyclone ever to cross the Australian coast, stroke the world. It was 270 kilometres an hour winds, and it blew it and the buildings up to a kilometre away. So when we went back in to rebuild, we went, okay, we have to find a smarter, simpler way to do this, which would get the cost down, because when you enter structural buildings of such high winds, the amount of steel and buildings you put into it is far too expensive. So we actually hybrided. We did half tents and half cabins. And this was 17, 18 years ago. And we actually built a cyclone-proof tent. What do I mean by that? Well, a cyclone-proof tent is basically a structural steel tent that can actually handle a wind load that can handle up to sort of 250 kilometers an hour as a structural building. But then with the fabrics, you have to take them off at different levels. So the PVC can only last up to 130 kilometers an hour wind. The canvas can last up to 150 kilometers an hour wind, but the actual structure can actually handle the full cyclone. So that became the evolution of eco structures and the tented world. With the tented world, it started off building 2 or 3 very, very remote places in Western Australia. Like we built a project called Karajini, which was 50 tents in the desert. Again, we used to always say it would cost you $100 to get a can of Coke delivered because it was just so remote. So everything you needed to do, you need to do it smarter and simpler. So from here, we did 15 kilometres of underground mains, power and water between each tent and around the whole village. I was never set out from there to actually then go into manufacture. This was actually just 2 building projects I had. And the building projects then sort of got so much notoriety, then people said, can I buy a tent? Can I buy a tent? And our journey started, and then sort of literally a couple of years later, we ended up building in the US Virgin Isles, we built in China into the hills and so forth. And every time we go and build, the customer then says, can you get a tent that can do this? Can you make your cabins do that? So we actually had to find a system that was able to actually accommodate all the needs of what the customer wanted, because he always wanted something slightly different. So we then developed lots of little projects within the system itself, which was, would you like it to go in the snow? Okay, so now we need a snow tent. It's unbelievably cold or unbelievably hot, so we need a thermal tent, which is we call a hybrid tent, which is actually, we call it built like a house but looks like a tent. It actually has full panel walls, fully insulated, and it performs like a house, but it's actually a tent from its visual looking. And this is starting to become the more of a focus for the high-end hotels and resorts. We all love the experiential tourism, but we would like it to perform to a higher level. Certainly some of the places that we're asked to build in, Bali or Thailand or any of those Asian countries, we're always inevitably on the side of a hill. So, being on the side of a hill, we then had to find a way to, how do we actually build on the side of a hill? So we created these lift kits and brace kits. The lift kits and brace kits then became more, what's the way, simpler to use than conventional building systems, because it was a system. So you didn't have to go back to the engineering department. It didn't have to get re-engineered. Our system was a total system that was engineered. And the same goes for when you're remote, about concrete, because what do you do about concrete? So the concrete is a major issue. You quite often you either got to mix it by hand or you've got to bring batching plants in. All of these things are phenomenally expensive. So we created a thing called an eco anchor. There's numerous sort of systems out there are very similar to it, but the eco anchors actually can bolt to our footings or our lift kits or our brace kits, and that allows us to actually build in any location we want to build. And this took us to, 4 years ago, we actually built in 5 Class A reserves. We built in the US Virgin Isles, We built on Lady Elliot Island. We built in China up in Kunming. And then we built at Rottnest Island. So these are all Class A reserves. And the reason we were able to build the Class A reserves is because we have such minimal impact on the environment and no, sort of concrete leaving anything behind. So the eco-anchor is a very important part of our system. But the thing is it's all about the system, because if you build not in steel and you actually sort of build in timber, it's very hard to judge the structural strength of everything, where the known properties of what steel is. And the other side of it, steel's also a great recyclable product, because you can actually then just recycle the steel after its lifespan.